Fawn Sharp is the Fawn Sharp is the current president of the Quinault Indian Nation of Tohola, Washington. Previously, Ms. Sharp was appointed by Governor Gary Locke to serve as trustee for Grays Harbor College. She has also served as governor of the Washington State Bar Association, no small feat, and trustee of the Washington State Bar Association, Indian Law Section. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Cummings. I'm incredibly honored to be here today to provide a tribal perspective on the platform, and I thank every committee member here this afternoon. The most urgent thing I would strongly recommend that the committee consider for its platform is an urgency to redefine the relationship between tribal nations and the United States. For far too long, the relationship has fallen incredibly short of where our ancestors, where the founding fathers envisioned the relationship with tribal nations. Countries around the world have embraced what we believe are fundamental principles that are absolutely necessary in the relationship we should have with the United States. In 2007, 144 countries at the UN General Assembly passed and approved the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 4 countries opposed it: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. The 3 countries that opposed it with the United States reversed the decision and now support it. In 2010, President Obama announced the U.S. would embrace the declaration. And from our perspective, we need to not only embrace the declaration, but 3 critical issues inside the declaration I think we need to do in the coming years. The first is a recognition that we have political equality. That means in a government-to-government relationship, we are equal political partners. And during the tenure of my presidency, I have witnessed firsthand unilateral action taken affecting our lands, territories, and resources. President Bill Clinton, along with President Obama, both endorsed a consultation policy. Bill Clinton adopted an executive order. President Obama passed a memorandum recognizing a consultation policy. But from our perspective, consultation is simply talk. And you could go throughout Indian country and find instances where we consulted, and even over our political objections, our policy objections, our scientific objections, when we consult, we walk away thinking we have the dispute resolved, only to find out there's unilateral action taken affecting our land, territory, resources, and people. We need political equality for that relationship to be redefined. The second is a way to negotiate disputes. If the United States has a dispute with Canada, they don't sit down, consult, and then proceed with a predetermined course of action. There's an element of diplomacy where, again, equal bargaining position is recognized, and you go through a dispute resolution and negotiation to resolve disputes. We don't have that luxury in Indian country. Our only option is lawsuits, and we've seen a string of lawsuits against the United States in my lifetime. The Cobell case was a $3.9 billion lawsuit tribal nations brought against the United States, the largest class action lawsuit in U.S. history for the failure of the United States to uphold its trust responsibility. So falling short of litigation, there's no mechanism to resolve disputes. That should be a second component of a redefined relationship. Third, and most importantly, is a recognition that we have inherent powers over our lands, territories, and those powers are exclusive. We've witnessed agencies such as the Internal Revenue Service raid our national treasuries and tax some of our most vulnerable citizens for general welfare benefits. So we need to safeguard our territories and jurisdiction. Related to the relationship, so from that perspective, there's not a recognition of the proper place for tribal nations in the relationship. We're way below. There's still an old perception that we're a ward and a guardian, that there's somehow no political equality at the table. But the second part of the relationship is on the United States side, the failure to uphold the trust responsibility. I would strongly encourage every member to take a look at a report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights called A Quiet Crisis. This was done in July of 2003. And I would maintain it's no longer a quiet crisis, it's a raging crisis, if not a humanitarian crisis in Indian country. And I want to just highlight just a few points where in this report they've talked about the failure to live up to the trust responsibility and what that means in Indian country. Housing. Right now, a third of Native American homes are overcrowded. 6% are considered inadequate. 1 in 5 reservation homes lacks plumbing. 16% lack telephone service. Healthcare. Despite widely documented healthcare disparities, the federal government spends less per capita on Native American healthcare than on any other group, including Medicaid recipients, prisoners, veterans, and military personnel. Annually, IHS spends 60% less on its beneficiaries than the average American citizen. Law enforcement, 60% the national average is spent law enforcement tribal communities. Education, we have high levels of dropout, 60% less federal funding per capita for tribal colleges and education. So it doesn't matter which indice you're looking at when it comes to funding for Native Americans. We are incredibly short. We have very limited ability to raise our own taxes, no funding. So it should be no surprise that many of the symptoms that you see on Indian country are symptoms of a much deeper problem. And that deeper problem is there's no political equality.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, Mr. Walker.
Teague Wheatseed, President Sharp, thank you for being here today. You brought up a lot of issues, and I know that I'm hoping that we get some copies for the platform committee here. My question is, what is the most urgent issue facing Indian country, and how can we address that on the platform committee?
I think probably the most urgent issue is the failure of the federal government to uphold its trust responsibility. It would begin by formalizing the relationship we have, tribal nations with the United States, increasing funding, and respecting our inherent and exclusive jurisdiction over our land, territories, and peoples to ensure that we have the ability to tax, raise revenues. Right now, we're trying to raise profits as corporations through casinos. We're governing bodies, and we have very limited ability to raise our own taxes to support these badly needed services. And on the other hand, funding is limited, so we're forced to either forego services or sue.
Dr. West?
Yes, thank you so very much for your very, very deep and moving testimony. It just strikes me that there's a need for us to reform our narrative about the emergence of the USA, and you tell me what you think. Oftentimes we hear in platforms and speeches that slavery was our original sin, and that's just not true. And the question becomes, how do we ensure that it's dispossession of land, of precious indigenous people, this domination, sometimes annihilation through disease as well as attack. And then you had African slavery, both, of course, evil and barbaric. But how do we reshape the narrative so that indigenous peoples are not rendered invisible and we remain in a state of denial? And that's the question of what kind of stories we tell to each other as we engage in these policies.
Yes, that was probably the most encouraging thing in when President Obama was first elected. I thought to myself that evening, that shattered the shackles of slavery and closed a chapter, a very dark chapter in U.S. history, and opened a new chapter of hope. And I thought, if you go back to the next chapter, the first chapter, our turn is next, and maybe, just maybe, we'll get to a point where the average citizen understands the extent to which tribal nations suffer. We're worse than some third world countries if you go into Indian country, and it's not a lack of trying, it's not a lack of choice, it's these fundamental issues that I'm talking about. Political equality. When you operate a nation and another country can take unilateral action over your objection, and at the same time do things that invade your national treasuries, do things that inhibit you from raising your own tax dollars, you're very limited. And if it's not corrected, and that's what this point of this report, and I want to stress the U.S. Civil Rights Commission right now is updating this report, and we're expecting to see it come out at the end of the year. And I'm hoping through an updated report we'll have more concrete steps, because there were a lot of recommendations in this report to get to the question that you're asking, what can we do? But very few of those recommendations were actually implemented.
We're going to go to Mr. McKinnon and then Ms. Browner.
Thank you so much for reminding us about this toxic relationship. I'd just be grateful if you could provide the committee at some later point with some good examples of places around the world that you think are doing a better job of getting this relationship right, because I think we've lacked for thinking creatively for a long time in this field.
Thank you. I appreciate that question. We had an opportunity to participate in COP14, the Conference of Parties in Poznan, Poland, and I had a chance to sit down with ambassadors and from other countries that have a foreign policy related to indigenous peoples, even though they have no indigenous peoples within their borders or territory. But those are excellent examples. And the issue of climate change is one where I believe in this country we're looking at innovation, things that we can do with emerging science. But I would stress there's a lot of traditional indigenous knowledge that's key to solving the largest global crisis facing our generation. And the United States can be a leader in the world if they not only look at new and emerging technologies, but look at the past, because our science and indigenous knowledge is not only valuable, it's proven through the generations and centuries of time. And we need to draw on all forms of knowledge to solve that global crisis.
We're going to have one more question, and that'll be from Ms. Browner. But the members of the Congress got a vote coming up, so the drafting committee members have been informed about the vote. So in my absence, and this was all agreed upon between the parties, I would turn the meeting over to Neera Tandon and to Jim Zogby. And I want to thank both of you for agreeing to do this, who will facilitate this meeting even-handedly. They will alternate introducing speakers and opening the floor to discussion. My colleagues and I will return at the conclusion of the votes. But again, we have to take one more question. Then, and after you, there'll be a 5-minute recess so people can stop for a minute.
I just
Thank you, Chairman.
thank you for your very powerful and insightful testimony, and thank you obviously for mentioning climate change and the role. There are in many of our nation's environmental laws a recognition of the government-to-government relationship on an Indian country, and EPA has had a history at times of actually delegating authority for permitting and other environmental activities. Do you see that as a potential model for some of the other issues? I mean, I'd be interested in, the degree to which you feel like that delegation of authority, it's the same way that EPA can delegate to states the opportunity to implement environmental laws on a day-to-day basis. And if it's not something you're familiar with, I totally understand it's a little bit in the minutia, but maybe you could answer in writing or provide sort of your thoughts in writing.
Right. I think that's an excellent question, and we've seen examples where there has been a delegation of authority, and it's not only us taking that authority that's delegated, but we bring that tribal perspective and that tribal mindset to those critically important decisions, and I think it's absolutely critical. When you look at things like the public trust doctrine, and that is an old law, it's not something you find in statute, it's judge-made law, and courts are now holding those that make permitting decisions and others around, transportation of crude oil, et cetera, liable, and increasing their fiduciary responsibility to consider climate-related impacts to those regulatory decisions. From our perspective, the public trust doctrine is reflective of indigenous knowledge. Chief Seattle said, what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. All things are connected. That's the spirit and intent behind the public trust doctrine. So I think when you have exercised delegated authority and bring a tribal perspective, it's an excellent way of addressing issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your important testimony, and we're going to take a 5-minute break.